Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Yes, it is strange times. I do have multiple affiliations, and like many people, also being a migrant, um, I have multiple place identities, and it's often very strange not being able to get places. And also, like people, many people during COVID, I've had family members die during COVID, and had virtual funerals and all kinds of strange things. So it's very strange times in some ways. But at the same time, as we have what at one level seem novel, we also have a range of things which to me are a continuation of previous issues. And in thinking through those kinds of things, uh, in thinking through those kinds of things, one of the things that strikes me is how significant it is to try and I know reconsider the way tourism has been going the last few years. And definitely, although I keep writing new things, in one sense, I feel like I've been writing the same thing for the last 25 years or so, or since I've been doing my PhD, in the sense of there having long-term signs respect to environment with respect to tourism's role in it, and the the basic debate surrounding the limits of growth has not gone away. If anything, it's become much more urgent. And I was also someone who's doing research on biosecurity for about the last 20 years. And for me, COVID-19 was something that was going to happen. In fact, I'd written a book chapter which came out almost literally the end of 2019 when it occurred. Um, I think also the type of pandemic was also acknowledged by many, and so one of the big questions for me, or one of several questions, is that why wasn't the tourism industry more prepared? Many governments were, but their planning when it came to actually dealing with it was poor, and a lot of it was the tension in terms of the focus on economic growth that government has, or in tourism on visitor growth, versus other concerns. And that issue of how do you get that balance to me is fundamental about thinking about any supposed recovery and thinking about what any form of responsible tourism might look like in the future. Um, this particular cartoon, which has been doing the rounds for a while, to me sums up the situation quite well. Um, COVID-19, even now, is not the only pandemic around the planet. It's the one that gets the most publicity, but there are other health pandemics which are still occurring, and there will be more in the future. And many of these diseases and disease transfers um, have much to do when you look at the research of humanity's relationship with nature, and in one sense getting closer to wild nature and becoming more interconnected. The role of zoonotic diseases has been acknowledged for a long time, and of course tourism has a part to play in this as well. um, that desire to go to longer, further, more exotic, more different places in terms of that contact. And if you look at the literature um, from the CDC, for example, and look at their material, you actually see them, urging caution about issues with ecotourism, for example, 20 years ago, and the potential for disease spread. So in one sense, it's nothing new, which obviously raises the question, do we ever learn? Um, but I think that's an important question. We have waves of problems which we're facing, some of which have been recognized for a long time. Um, and at the same time, we're now having many governments And obviously it's also individual businesses and destinations looking at how tourism will recover. But what does that recovery actually mean? And what is it they want to recover? If you look at some of the academic literature, there's lots of comments about regeneration or regenerative tourism, transformative tourism. But if you look at what most governments and what most tourism bodies are saying, their focus is on income, it's on employment, it is on getting foreign exchange back, it is on economic growth. It's not on regeneration, except usually in a marketing kind of sense to enable people to regenerate and recover, not so much in terms of allowing the planet to recover. You have discourses, it seems to me, within some of the academic field, which does not really cross over into the discourses which you have in the policy field and which you have in terms of what industry are actually focusing on. Now, in some cases, they may even use the same words like sustainability, but when you start scratching the surface of that, you then have a substantial difference between focusing on so-called sustainable growth versus focusing on actual sustainable development. So in other words, actually focusing on the qualities of sustainability, not just the amount of sustainability, however that may be determined. Um, but to me, that this raises um, issues about what is being focused on. And already we are starting to see the emergence of incentives to encourage tourists to return. And in many cases, these constitute, one could argue, something of a race to the bottom, in that you have a focus on maybe discounting, um, handouts. In fact, in some countries, vouchers have already been used to stimulate economic activity to be used in hospitality sector or to be used in the tourism sector. In some locations, there are in effect subsidized holidays being made available to start bringing the tourists back. Obviously, we have the use of marketing and promotional campaigns. And these are being tied in with vaccine passports and clearances and all kinds of arrangements which are being used. Unlike many, or maybe I'm showing my age, I'm not so worried about vaccine passports or vaccination for that matter, um, because vaccination for travel has been required for many, many years. I'm, I find it fascinating, the contemporary debate about people having to have vaccinations to go places. You already are required to have vaccinations to go places for many countries in many locations. It is nothing new. It is absolutely nothing new. Um, I think what is the difference is the potential use of vaccination passports and clearances by the private sector to not allow entrance into particular attractions or events or even hotels. That may be quite different. But in terms of the use of vaccine passports and clearances, that to me is bog standard um, international sanitary procedures, absolutely bog standard. What will be different probably is it being tied into online platforms rather than just having a piece of paper. But even there, it's like when you fly sometimes, or when we can fly, as well as being able to have it on your the details of the ticket on the smartphone. For many airports, you actually require it in paper as well. And I'm sure we're going to have the same thing when it comes to vaccine passports and clearances. But we are at the stage already, of course, particularly when we look at Europe and their efforts there to recover tourism, to use these passports and clearances to use in conjunction with marketing and promotion campaigns. And I am quite sure they're going to be used in some cases with particular incentives from the lodging sector, from the transport sector, from attractions to encourage tourists to return. I think there is a lot of pent up demand. It takes a very long time for practices to change. The nature of that shift will be interesting, perhaps with respect to what level of the return to tourism will be international versus domestic. It is interesting looking at that even here in New Zealand, because obviously when people cannot travel overseas, they can travel locally. And although some centres in New Zealand, for example, have obviously recorded quite substantial drops in terms of the number of visitors, some areas have actually done better. They've actually done better recently, particularly as the domestic tourists who often wouldn't go there to go elsewhere are now exploring some parts of the country. Not all, but there are some areas which are doing better than usual. So you're also going to have a lot of turbulence in the system. But with respect to the changes which are taking place, what will the implications be? One of the things which I see very little discussion about, but I think it's going to be significant, is when you have the recovery, particularly raising the bottom, what will be the implications for workers and employment rights? Tourism is already one of those areas which is categorized, particularly in countries which do not have labor laws, or you have situations which is very common in tourism, that tourism is a very lowly unionized area, that workers and employment rights tend to be treated quite poorly. That may well be affected even further as you have businesses trying to offer incentives, low cost incentives for people to return. And that usually means trying to keep wages down. In terms of the implications for destination communities, it'll be fascinating seeing what new balances, if you can call it balances, are met as tourists return. Um, Obviously, there is no discussion about the opportunity to gain some sort of balance between visitation in terms of numbers at least, and in terms of communities and their response to having so many tourists in some cases. But when you have governments and businesses who are so desperate to get their economic growth numbers back up, what will happen with that? We go back to where we were in the first place, because we're going to need the tourists in terms of the economy? What's the argument will go? And obviously, what are the implications going to be for the environment? What differences will it make? Are we going to be back to where we were before? And in terms of thinking about this, one of the things I think that's being forgotten is that if you were to look at the UNWTO international forecasts, obviously they've had a major drop. But it needs to be borne in mind that before COVID-19, international tourism was already at a very high level in terms of their projections. And even given COVID-19 and some of the forecasts you have, you look at the data and you look at the projected growth rates post COVID-19, and it still means that we're more than likely to get back to the original projection that UNWTO had for 2030, which therefore means that many of the concerns which existed regarding tourism's contribution, for example, to climate change, are not going away. They are still with us, and with us more than ever. And I think one of the concerns here, and this is one of those diagrams I tend to show a lot over the last few years, and all I keep doing is adding to one end, is it means the issue of trying to make tourism responsible doesn't go away. The limits to growth debate hasn't gone away. to me, it's the fundamental debate we should be having in tourism, but it is a very, very, very much a minority debate, even in academia. And that debate is even smaller, minute even, if you look at policy regarding tourism overall around the world. Yes, there are some isolated locations and destinations which have this debate about limits to growth in terms of tourism and issues of sustainability. But the reality is this debate has not had, I think, any substantive difference to the trajectory of tourism at all. We've had a situation in which the ecological footprint of tourism has been growing. Apart from the COVID period, there have been a couple of bumps, but it still keeps continuing to grow. It's a function of a number of things. It's a function of population growth, just simple population growth. It is a function of um, a bit more of dispersal of income, sufficient income to enable people to travel. It's also a function of the very strong emergence of consumer society and the desire to travel, which in ways which is quite different from previous destinations. Um, I'm someone whose aunts lived, I had three aunts who lived to the ripe old age of 100. And my oldest aunt could actually remember the first plane arriving from France across the Channel in the south of England. She was a child at the time. Um, that is a generation for which the majority of people, apart from the elite, did not have a massive desire to go traveling in the same way as people do now. There has been a shift, a clear shift in consumption practices over the last 100 years, which are still with us. And I am not sure whether COVID-19 is going to dramatically affect in any substantial way. I would love to be proved wrong. Um, and it means that the pressure you have in terms of growth and the real limits that exist in terms of capacity to absorb that growth, that is still with us. What we have seen over the last 40 years, and is even before I started my time researching, it's a whole series of different types of alternative or responsible tourisms. We now have another lot in terms of regenerative and transformative tourisms. Does it mean that there's going to be any substantial change? I think the answer is no. In fact, we have a very positive correlation between you know, ecological pressure and the amount of writing that exists, or the new terms that keep being invented to describe the same old problem of how do we deal with this. And it's something which we're not dealing with terribly well. And it is the same problem. It is the same problem. We even have some issues like biodiversity, which in some ways I regard as a more serious issue than climate change, although obviously they're very interconnected. And even that in reality is a minority concern within tourism. And in fact, sustainability itself is a minority concern within tourism studies. I know people think, well, what are you saying? If you actually look at the publications in tourism, the amount of publications which have tourism and sustainability in, for example, title or keywords or abstract, it's usually around 11, 12% of all publications in a year, and that has been holding steady for a while. Sustainability is a minority concern. It is a minority concern in tourism studies. And it is, in one sense, a minority concern in policy, because that's not where the focus is. And I apologize to people who may have seen this diagram before, but to me, we have a real issue of scale, because so much of the concerns over responsible tourism or whatever alternative tourism we want to be discussing, or we can even think of it in terms of over tourism, the classic response has been to, we just need to shift those people around. that is what we will do. And of course, when those areas have more pressure, you then have a situation if you shift them around further. Except the problem we have is that we only have one pale blue dot, which is one planet, and you can't keep shifting people around. You have this issue of how do we respond to that? You can look at it another way in terms of the extent to which natural capital is actually being available to wildlife and as part of natural environment versus how it's allocated in terms of society. And we have a situation quite clearly where the amount of natural capital is being run down and utilized much more by humans. I am not showing the slide today, but there's a slide I show undergrads, which is the amount of biomass which is made up of, in mammals, of humans and domesticated animals versus the amount of biomass which is wild mammals. And of course, biomass, which is wild mammals, is only about 3 or 4% of the total mammalian biomass on the planet. But of course, when you have people who can watch Animal Planet or other documentaries on television, they do not see that. And most people do not have a global sense of what is happening. And for very good reasons, most people are very much boxed into their own location. They see problems locally, which can be very informative, clearly, but they don't necessarily get that global perspective of how serious the problem is. And tourism is tied up in this because of the extent to which tourism is running down natural capital, even though at the same time we have all these stories, which is what they are, about the benefits that tourism brings for things like an economic justification for conserving charismatic species or protected areas and national parks, which of course it does. And though the problem is, and I'm someone who's guilty of this because I'm someone who never meant to, I never meant to become an academic. I'm not from a university family whatsoever. Complete accident on my part. But what I was doing before I entered academia was doing policy work. And I was one of these people who was advocating for tourism to justify conservation measures. What I didn't appreciate at the time, and what most people do not appreciate now, is you have a real issue with that, is that in the short term, yes, you can use tourism to justify conservation. Maybe it's one of the few justifications we can work with, but that is a short-term impact. The long-term impact is that you still have people going to those places, still with emissions, still trampling, still spreading diseases, still spreading species on their footwear, etc., etc., etc. So we're just, in essence, trading off short-term with long-term issues, and we don't escape this problem of tourism and the limits to growth and this wider problem that we have on the planet now. So how then do we deal with that, and what does recovery actually mean? And I suppose in one sense, it's, what are we recovering from? And clearly the dominant focus is on COVID-19, very good reasons, I completely understand. And its health and economic impact, which are clearly intertwined, they cannot be separated. And although there's discussion in the academic literature about widening the debate for opportunities for restart, and there are elements of it in some reporting, how possible actually is it to genuinely broaden out the focus of governments to understand tourism within a broader context, which includes the environment, includes emissions? And it's very difficult. And maybe the debate is being broadened out about tourism, but it's still very much focused on that urgent need, because of other policy settings governments have, to get people back in employment and having income. And this opportunity for a reset is not like it's anything new. We've had other crises which have provided opportunities for resets. But does a pandemic make it easier or more difficult to change, the trajectories that tourism is going in? Or will it pretty much stay the same? And unfortunately for me, and this is partly because I actually started off in academia, um, not in tourism at all, really, but in geography and conservation, looking at natural resources. One of the things we know from natural hazards research is that when you have a disaster, it doesn't necessarily mean people change behaviors. In fact, at times they will intensify the existing behaviors. And we've seen that in terms of response to economic crisis at times, where the problem isn't the market, it's that we need more of the market. That you get that kind of response. Um, and so you have real issues, therefore, in thinking about what will the trajectories and possible transformations actually be, um, especially when the default position, for very good reasons, of organizations is to survive. And we live in an organizational world, and you want those organizations, tourism businesses, governments even, want to survive. That's part of the nature of organizations. Now and there is a difference between having a resilient organization and having a resilient destination. They are related, but not the same. And I think it's therefore very important to be thinking about what will the trajectory be? Because the problem, as I see it, is that if you have intensification of existing trajectories with a focus on economic growth and tourist numbers, then obviously we're in real trouble. But even if we have the existing, I won't call it optimistic trajectory, which is the default position of most governments and UNWTOs and bodies, which is to focus on efficiency and adopt so-called green growth strategies without having a fundamental change in consumption. I don't think that is really regenerative. It's certainly not going to help the planet recover. It may assist in terms of local economies to recover, but it's not going to help the planet because there's still a focus on growth. And even when you look at the more optimistic scenarios which emerge from UNWTO and similar bodies, there's still growth. Even growth strategy, there's still growth in international tourism. There's still growth in emissions. There may be a lower per capita per tourist um, amount of emission, but the sum total is still greater, which means, of course, we only have one planet, so we haven't solved the problem. The optimistic trajectory, and the one obviously which I've been focused on for quite a long time, with no impact really, is the transforming so we focus more on sufficiency and sustainable consumption. I mean, to me, that's the most responsible trajectory. And very importantly, that trajectory doesn't mean less tourism. The problem isn't the amount of trips. That's not the problem. In fact, when I discuss this or try and discuss this with people, I emphasize a degrowth strategy, for example, a focus on sufficiency and more sustainable consumption does not mean less tourism. What it does mean is reducing the total distance that we travel and how fast and how we travel. You can imagine, as we try and do, an alternative future in which there is more tourism, but that tourism is much more local. It runs much more with public transport, and you do not have the total amount of distance that people travel. That is the response. It's not saying no tourism. I never say that. It is about a type of tourism that really does focus on its impacts and is honest about them. But these kind of issues really come back to concerns over scale in many ways. And one of my frustrations over the years, and I think coming in part from a geography background, um, you're very focused on scale, because a lot of the discussion about responsible tourism and destinations are seen in the case of champions at a destination or champions at a business, and good on them, fantastic. But the big question remains, how does what they do permeate through the system, and how does it contribute to global sustainability? And this obviously from an academic perspective is interesting, but it's really a practical issue, because how do we reconcile what happens at the local level with what happens at the global level, and how do those things work up and down? And I think there's lots of focus on resilient destinations and regions and businesses, or sustainable destinations, regions and businesses. And I think I understand that, but the bigger question of how the global, how tourism is used, is not addressed enough. And tourism to me it's a means, not an end in itself. But you have a situation in which, in many cases and for many people, it has become almost regarded as an end. And the problem is, as far as I see it, we're looking at a non-transformation of tourism, a non-genuine regeneration, because we have these issues of the race to the bottom in terms of strategies. We have the continued measure of success in very crude numbers. It's what politicians understand, and it's actually what the majority of people understand. In that, it's ironic that that the numbers of visitors is used without looking at issues what you might use in business of yield and the total income that is drawn. But the focus continues on numbers, and unless you have an increase in numbers, it's very hard for politicians and people to understand that that doesn't necessarily equate to success. I'm sure everyone here understands it, and some people in business understand it in some ways, but the political desperation that we are facing in terms of responding to COVID-19 means that we're going to go back to looking at numbers, I'm absolutely sure. And the other thing, which is also an issue from a global perspective, is that I quite realize that there is some idle capital at the moment in tourism, in aviation and in the cruise ship industry, for example. How will it be used? You are getting situations where, yes, a very small number of cruise ships are being disposed of, and some planes are being disposed of. But the reality is they're out there waiting to come back. And their lifespan is still going to be the same 30 odd plus years. In many cases, they'll be flying. They're out there. They'll be back. And I think that is also a major issue in trying to transform and shift that trajectory of tourism. And even if an airline goes bust, in fact, it even creates even worse scenarios, because it means people can buy those planes at rock bottom prices, and they can just be shipped elsewhere or flown elsewhere, the better description. So you have these issues. So the problem hasn't gone away. There's lots of displacement, which is occurring in international tourism, and lots of fluidity, which will continue for another couple of years. But displacement and fluidity is not the same as transformation. And I use the analogy these days, it's more like the deck chairs being moved around the Titanic. And I think that's what we're seeing and what we will see in terms of tourism's recovery. the problem we have in terms of thinking about tourism growth is that how we deal with the effects of at different scales. The focus on over tourism, the last couple of so-called over tourism, the last couple of years is interesting, but it's very local. It's very local. It hasn't been usually conceptualized in terms of over tourism at a global scale, which in one sense is where the really, really, really big problem lies, because we're all affected by it. And we know that greenhouse gas emissions, they occur somewhere, but their impacts permeate the global system. And we feel the effect of climate and global change locally because it occurs somewhere and we experience it somewhere, but it is the wider system as being affected. But those kind of issues tend to be not treated terribly well. So, you know, any notion of responsible tourism post-COVID ideally needs to be a response to which we're trying to understand that way in which you have that embeddedness in the local economy and in the local and in the global system. It's multi-scale in scope. And so, you know, I think what we have, not just in tourism, is what can be termed, and it's not my phrase originally, although I quite like it, is this notion of analytical apartheid. In that more often than not, there's a separation between the socio-economic side over here and the environmental side over there. I know it's not there all the time, and there's obviously people, and I'm sure I'm talking to those here who are aware of that connectivity. But if you look at many policy settings, it doesn't seem to be the case. There's a focus on the economic benefits that tourism can bring, and I completely understand that. And the current policy response is very much on bringing tourists and back, but it's being done for economic reasons and economic growth reasons, not for environmental reasons. And the environmental side is not being dealt with. And in fact, there's almost a kind of malaise with some policymakers because of the assumed notion, which is not particularly correct, that because of COVID-19, there's been so much of a large drop in greenhouse gas emissions, which is not obviously really the case. So we come back to a real problem. And that problem is, yes, you can have a small island of responsible tourism, whether it be a destination or whether it be a business. Yes, we can champion them, but the reality is you still have those other processes occurring around that small island. And the reality is those small islands are being swamped by the system. And that to me is the situation we are at. Small islands of limited sustainability surrounded by a global system which is not sustainable. And that is that issue of dealing and understanding scale. COVID-19 is nothing more than a short blip in terms of growth. You can see those blips in terms of other previous recessions or oil crises over the last 50 years. Fundamentally, nothing has changed. So where to? A lot of focus is put on the sustainable development goals. Many universities, including mine, are now doing reporting according to the sustainable development goals. It's interesting, there's lots of a focus on them without there necessarily being a critical examination of their appropriateness. And one of the things that concerns me, especially in a tourism context, is that if you look at the statements by the UNWTO, for example, and in some of the reports they do with UNDP, or you look at the World Travel and Tourism Council, the focus is still on growth and using growth to end poverty. Great. but can you really have that economic growth? Can it really be so decarbonized in a narrow as to protect the planet? Can you really have growth so you will not take away any more habitat? How do you respond to that? And so it strikes me, and I did a paper on this a couple of years ago. We have a situation in which we are dealing with what has been described as the managerial ecology, in this case, the managerial ecology of tourism. And that is this faith in the instrumental application of science and utilitarian economic approaches. That's the focus that's being used. But as Babington rightly describes it, what you actually have, and he used the example of the Newfoundland cod fishery, is actually a form of managed ice annihilation. In that there's this notion that you can fix the problem by being more rational in one sense. And so you have situations, for example, in which you have UNWTO, I'm picking on them, in which they acknowledge how complex tourism is. They acknowledge how difficult it is to but at the same time embrace that kind of approach, and not really understanding the nature of complexity of the tourism system and the embeddedness of tourism within the wider global environmental system. And in terms of how that is imagined, it is very, very much geared to the demands of the market. Is there an alternative? Well, there are, but those other worldviews tend to be in the minority, or maybe you could rephrase that, they are not part of the discourse of those in power. It's not part of the dominant discourses in policy making. And so we have a situation in which the fundamental human ecosystem relationship is not really being addressed, which is the issue of how do we learn to live within planetary boundaries? But how can we even search for alternatives when tourism, the way it has developed, is so imbued with market values? Now, I'm not saying the market doesn't have a place, but market values and technocratic values are what dominate thinking about tourism and what dominant notions of sustainability and responsible tourism look like. And that means, therefore, and I think I've been using this particular diagram for about 12 years now, there's minor tweaks, the focus keeps being put on efficiency, more productive, efficient use of materials and energy, having a lower per tourist impact in terms of emissions, for example. Yes, I understand it, but it doesn't deal with the issue of growth. And it doesn't deal with the issue of only having one planet, and that is the absolute impact of tourism, which is important, not just the impact of an individual. It's the absolute impact on the planetary system, which is what is significant. Therefore, in terms of responsible tourism and recovery, the focus needs to be not just on efficiency, as important as that is. It needs also to be on sufficiency, the actual consumer behavior. And it means also bringing in issues of how do we intervene to change consumer practices and influence consumer practices so they occur in a more sustainable fashion. Now, the market is a part of that, but just as significantly, so is regulation. In fact, regulation may be more important than the market. And one of the interesting things, for example, and this is a discussion which is occurring here to an extent here in New Zealand, is that just putting a tax on travel, unless it's a massive tax, will probably make no difference whatsoever with respect to overall long distance travel. It has to be a massive tax to have any difference. And is that going to happen? Some colleagues of mine did a paper about 5 years ago, I think it was. And the paper we pointed out that at the time, if you wanted to offset carbon emissions of international travel, it was at the time, it was only about, I think, $26, $27 American for each trip, and you could offset. But even amount like that doesn't deal, even though it helps with offsetting, it doesn't actually deal with this bigger issue of that growth would still continue. It's the consumption. Both need to be addressed. You need to address consumption as well as efficiency of consumption, because it is all framed by the environment and the fact we're on one planet. And the problem we have is that the worldviews which dominate this are very much geared into weak sustainability approaches. There's just minor changes to behavior. The focus and policy is not on what may be described as strong sustainability. In terms of policy approaches, they tend to be geared more towards utilitarian and some psychological and social marketing approaches. And the role of nudging. Nudging is important. Social marketing is important. But ultimately, it's about the system. How do we shift the system? How do we deal with, to use the language that's used, how do we deal with the socio infrastructure, the institutions in which we are locked in? And how do we change by far the most important thing, which is routine habit? Only a very small part of our consumption is consciously thought of. It so much as routine, including, I would argue, so much of our tourist and travel consumption. How do we then shift that to encourage shorter supply chains, to encourage localization and reduce some of those effects? The market alone, social marketing, is not sufficient. It only affects a small amount of practices. It requires that the other dimension of regulatory practices also to come in to change behaviors. So how do we respond to these issues? Scale matters. And I think local capacities and resource issues are important, especially if it also helps people understand the global concern. But it's difficult because the problem's global. Our consumption affects people elsewhere. Our travel affects not just the destination, but going to and from. The emissions from that flow through the entire system. And it's really hard to get people thinking about that. It's bad enough getting academics thinking about it, let alone people who don't study it. So scale becomes an important issue. And also, if we're thinking about recovery and resilience, so much of the discussion is not about bouncing back in a kind of way that becomes more environmentally friendly or sustainable economically. So much of the recovery and the so-called bouncing back is just about adaptation and survival. And survival by itself may be an appropriate goal of sustainability at an organizational level, but that doesn't necessarily equate to sustainability at a planetary level. And while we have this focus on efficiency, it doesn't deal with the question of absolute growth. And the problem that we have is that tourism research and the vast majority of tourism education embraces growth. It's often hidden in the system, but that is what is there. It embraces growth because it doesn't look at for example, what's the implication of this marketing campaign, these actions, what we do here, not just on here, but elsewhere. And the default position is growth. And we have growthism. And of course, as part of that, how much sustainability education and research do we really have anyway? And it's actually precious little. And as someone who these days also teaches in marketing, I mean, one of the things I find absolutely fascinating is how little part of marketing journals and marketing research is actually done in relation to sustainability and things like climate change. Business schools, as they are, and I work in one, they are normally conceived, for example, are part of the problem. They are an enormous problem in terms of what they teach, because it doesn't question basic assumptions about the system and thinking of how individual actions affect the system and vice versa. Debates on growth are obviously important in tourism, but they are inseparable from the wider limits to growth debate. We go back to Ehrlich. We go back to a discussion we've been having since the 1970s and the oil crisis. The fundamental debate have not been the slightest. We only therefore have one planet. What is the carrying capacity of the planet? What is over tourism on a planetary scale? And there's very few people which even think about that, really. The number of researchers that deal with these things is tiny in proportion to the overall amount of people who research tourism. The issue that we have is that the long term eventually becomes the short term. And much of what's advocated is just minor change. And as I also suggest deliberately, provocatively, if we are truly honest, how many people really care about this? I don't want to be too depressing, but I think it's a very important question. The vast majority of tourism academics don't care about it. Not in terms of what they teach, what they publish. It's not an issue. Sustainability tends to be seen in terms of business and business, helping the business survive, making the business greener. Doesn't question the fundamentals whatsoever. Now, there's nothing wrong at all with making the business greener. But how green should it be? Should it be regulated to be greener? I mean, they're much more difficult questions. What responsibilities do businesses have? Really dealing with some of those ethical issues. And what sustainable tourism really would look like, which may well mean that some parts of tourism should actually go into decline. And that is really, really hard to have that argument. Some areas would do better, some areas would do worse. And in terms of that, we obviously come to aviation, and I'd also argue probably cruise ships as well. And they have enormous political clout in terms of how tourism policy is made. But those sectors in particular are the problem. They are the problem. And how then do we deal with that? Because it's a political problem. How do we get beyond BAU? Brooklyn as usual. Because one of the issues that you have is that in terms of supposed transformation or regeneration, it's embedded in an understanding of sustainability and this notion of balance, which it gets quoted ad infinitum, without appreciating that any balance between economic growth and green and the environment actually is a false balance, because you're certainly surrounded by the environment. We have one planet And that is our resource limits. So how then do we change that thinking? Because much notions of sustainable tourism and responsible tourism are geared to thinking of it in terms of sustainable growth, whatever that may mean. The UNWTO have been describing tourism as a sector of hope. I'm sure that kind of language will continue to come out in the post-COVID period. But the only real hope, as I see it, is for the growth mentality which affects tourism and much tourism research needs to shift to one which starts to conceive of tourism as occurring within planetary limits. And so a kind of a conclusion is that we are always in states of change. But what is important is what sort of state we want to move and how we're going to get there. As it is at the moment, and I hate to be so sanguine, I see no fundamental resetting overall, and it isn't a question of overall because of COVID-19. Yes, there are some destinations, some locations who are talking about changing behaviors, but they are hugely in the minority. They are hugely in the minority. So it means coming back to addressing that difference between sustainable development and sustainable growth, and focusing on sustainable development, focusing on the qualitative changes which are needed, and on the human and ethical response to that, which tourism can be part of. But the issue for me, and the issue I think as well, I think for tourism researchers overall, as well as the industry, is there is a need to seriously address these questions. These questions are not going to go away. You can't just put them back a couple of years, which is the suggestion of obviously of many of the airlines and cruise ships and other businesses so they can recover. It doesn't make it go away. In fact, it makes it even harder to address because time, as we know, particularly with climate change, is running out. So the conclusion, therefore, is somewhat depressing. I apologize for that. But if we clearly want to be dealing with recovery, we clearly want to be dealing with responsibility, the ultimate responsibility is to be addressing these questions. Thank you.